computer. So from here on out, we'll have a recording of this. Everything will be posted on our website as per usual, but name and affiliation is always helpful as we keep the minutes for the meeting. And we'll go through and welcome you to the East Coast SAV Collaborative. So this is our SAV and Aquaculture Interactions quarterly meeting. And so we started this whole journey with you. We sent out the announcement that we just had our 1-year anniversary for forming the East Coast SIS. Forming the SAV Collaborative. So I'm Elizabeth Lacey and formed this with Brooke Landry and Jesse Jarvis. And so given that, our numbers have certainly grown, so we're not going to spend time kind of doing a round robin of introductions. But if there's anyone that's new to the group that wants to introduce themselves, certainly if you want to raise your hand and come off mute to introduce yourselves that's new to the group, certainly do that now. Or if not, you can certainly, like I said, put your name and affiliation in the chat. We are so thankful because this collaborative certainly would not be possible with all of you having joined it. It's remarkable. It definitely has filled a need, and that was the goal from the very beginning, is to fill that niche and to get all of you sharing data, sharing information has been really important to us. And so the topics all began from that first meeting where we kind of created a bunch of sticky notes about topics of interest and then voted on them. And so what we'll be doing kind of at our halftime, if you will, is that there were 2 left from that original idea of all the potential topics for us to cover in the East Coast SAV Collaborative. And so around halftime today is where we'll vote on the order of the last 2. So that's kind of the game plan for today. But one of the other things that we wanted to kind of go through is where some of those resources lie, since there might be some new people or even some visitors. So what I'm going to share is just the website briefly, because it's grown quite a bit. So this is the home base, the East Coast SAV Collaborative, and Caitlin's worked really hard to ensure that we're keeping things as up to date as possible here. And so definitely home base for all of the meetings if you go to the calendar. But then once the meeting has passed, Caitlin's done a really great job of ensuring all of the materials are posted there. So for instance, our quarterly meeting on the SAV restoration, one of the deliverables was the SAV regulatory database. And that actually came up. I went up to the training that we did for the seed flowering that was held up with a large group of individuals in the Northeast. And so I referenced this during that conversation about the regulations that are spanning from Maine to North Carolina. So all of that effort, we want to make sure that you understand where those deliverables actually are housed. And we decided it would be a living document. And so that database is actually here. And so the presentations are here, the agenda is here. All of these are posted in this space. So future reference, if you aren't able to attend a meeting, we record them, they're posted, there's meeting minutes that are posted. Of course, we want you here so that you can participate, but if you can't make a meeting, know that that's one of the places that you can be finding that information. The other thing for membership as well, the directory can help you locate people from different regions. We are in need of representatives for Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and DC. We still need steering committee representation, so you can search through and find people. We've had some membership numbers grow. And so we do need, like for instance, DC, we have a member, but we don't have a steering committee member, or 2. So there's 2 steering committees for each state. And we obviously want to be able to rotate people off of that, which means we need more names on this membership roster. So you can do a Google form, add your name to the membership directory, and then also consider if you might want to be a steering committee member for that. And the other kind of fun thing, if you didn't already know, that you can be part of the member spotlight or be nominated for that. Again, so you can learn a bit more about the members in the collaborative. So just kind of a plug for that. If you yourself in your region are forming, like the Mass Bay group, we're kind of housed or serving as a link point on our website. So in our goal of serving as a hub, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're just also trying to serve as a place that we can link others. So for that group, they didn't really have a centralized place to have their link. And so Caitlin worked with them to ensure that all of their material is housed someplace. So those were some of the announcements. Brooke, Jesse, other?
Yeah, can I point out, we also, Caitlin added a jobs page. So if you happen to be hiring for a position in the seagrass realm, we're happy to add it to the jobs page on the website too. So we've got a few listed up there now, which hopefully we'll be adding some more soon. I'm going to be hiring soon. So.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Awesome. Jesse, any?
No, just to add that if you're looking, it's also a good place. But besides that, nothing for right now.
Great. Membership is free, so feel free to join the collaborative. There's no like restrictions on who can join, right? It's just this idea that if you are interested in SAV, particularly if you have a role in your current position, it's of an interest to you, by all means, put your name on the membership list and you can be involved. So goals for this meeting, right? So we've, if you've looked at the agenda, that's again posted on the website, but in this case, I'll share it here. You're looking at 2 presentations to start with, one by Joe Carr. And so that's going to be aquaculture and SAV restoration. And then next will be Aaron Shields on aquaculture gear and SAV. Then we'll take just a brief break for some kind of burning questions or just take a pulse in the room where we're at for those. Then next we'll have 2 perspectives, one from Charlie Deaton on North Carolina regulations and one from Zach Gordon, kind of getting us that aquaculture perspective. He's the NOAA Northeast Regional Aquaculture Liaison. Then that break, like I said, kind of our halftime-ish, and a poll on whether or not we'll do next nature-based solutions on SAV. So kind of the idea of living shorelines and SAV interactions, or mitigation will be the next topic. Then panel discussion. So really out of all the presentations, if there were some additional questions, thoughts, that's our time to have that discussion. And then we want to get into this next large event. Last year we had ODU and NASA had planned, so Victoria Hill and Dick Zimmerman graciously offered to host a 2-day workshop. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish during the second or latter half of our meeting today, is have that planning discussion or just beginning conversations and form a committee really to get into the nitty-gritty of planning that joint meeting with both aquaculture and SAV. So that's the game plan for today. All right. We're a little ahead of schedule, but I don't think anyone will mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it on over to Jill.
Thank you, Z. While I'm getting set up here, I'll just apologize that the title and the agenda is not quite what I'm going to be talking about. So I apologize if you had gotten excited about a restoration talk. All right. Are you seeing my slides now? Okay, great. Good. So yes, I'm Jill Carr. I'm from the Bass Bays National Estuary Partnership. I'll be talking about perceptions, management, and data gaps across New England and the Gulf of Maine pertaining to eelgrass and aquaculture interactions. This is a pet project that my colleague Danny Badger at MIT Sea Grant and I took on just because of things that we were seeing and concerns that we were having. So this is unfunded work and we're working toward funding it up. And we really embarked on this line of study because we were seeing a lot of what you see in that background image there, where you know, aquaculture is kind of exploding here in Massachusetts and eelgrass continues to decline. And, you know, just through clicking around in Google Earth and some GIS exercises, you can find these areas of overlap where it's kind of unclear what's happening. Is this a good relationship, a bad, or a neutral relationship? The problem and some of the bigger challenges about specifically oyster aquaculture and eelgrass is that they tend to occupy similar habitat conditions. They both require shallow, protected, relatively low energy areas, often the intertidal or very near shore subtidal areas. And in the literature, there's a fair amount of literature about interactions between these two, but it's really a mixed bag. So there's some that points to a positive relationship, some negative, some neutral, and some really inconclusive literature. So it leaves everybody sort of scratching their head, you know, is this a good or bad combination of uses? And then, of course, a challenge being that aquaculture is expanding very rapidly. It's highly valuable here in New England, yet it's far from reaching its full potential here in terms of surface area. So there's a lot of growth sort of on the horizon, especially as, you know, some folks might be moving out of some fisheries and into others. And then, of course, large scientific and management gaps that we have. We really don't know how effective our management strategies are that we have in place now, the effects of different gear types that are used locally, and so on. So with all those kind of questions and challenges in mind, Danny and I convened regulators and researchers across the Gulf of Maine in the fall of 2022 to sort of try to dig down into some of these questions. We started the day, it was a full day workshop that we started with a keynote from Dr. Lee Howarth. He's the author of the review paper that has a screenshot there. It's a really wonderful paper if you've not had a chance to read it yet. After the keynote, we had paired lightning presentations from one manager and one scientist in each state and province, as well as one from NOAA as well. And it was just a really great event, really eye-opening. We recorded the entire thing except for some of the breakout room work, and the link is here in the slides, but then I can also put it in the chat when I'm done. Some takeaways from the Howarth paper that I thought this group might be interested in. Generally, the studies that he reviewed, he found that intertidal aquaculture nearly always had a negative effect on eelgrass in density and biomass, whereas more suspended floating gear in the subtidal area tended to be less impactful. There was greater use of BMPs, like spacing the rows more, using slack in the lines, using certain gear types like bags instead of trays to reduce shading. So it seemed like there's a lot of potential there to reduce impacts. And then he also refers to some studies that showed benefits of aquaculture gear on eelgrass through things like water filtering and fertilizing the seagrasses. So really a mixed bag there. So feel free to go ahead and watch that 2 to 3 hour video if you like, but I've also tried to condense some of the salient points here into this table for all of the states and provinces that were present. And just to give you a little bit of a summary here, across the Gulf of Maine, most states and provinces are experiencing that rapid aquaculture growth, as well as continued eelgrass declines. They all require some form of license or a lease. They all have different conditions and terms to those. Nearly all of the states and provinces conduct government surveys of the proposed lease areas using various methods that you can see there, scuba, drop cameras, and so on. All of them have some form of regulatory language. They all have aquaculture language for sure, but some of them have SAV specific language. Some of them are a little more generic to, you know, critical and important marine habitats and so on. Only 2 of the states use management buffers from what was presented during the workshop. Massachusetts and Connecticut both use a 25-foot buffer from either the lease boundary or the gear itself, a 25-foot buffer. All of the states and provinces highlighted a need for improved SAV mapping. And then that second to last column is just sort of interesting miscellaneous notes from each area. And the one I wanted to point out to you all that was unique was that in New Brunswick, Canada, they implement something called bay management plans. That's really to manage all the uses of the bay, including aquaculture, where they have a 10% carrying capacity threshold, where no more than 10% of the surface area of an embayment will be developed with aquaculture uses. So I thought that was really interesting. I didn't see that strategy used anywhere else. I'm curious if that's happening in, you know, further down the coast. One of the outcomes of the workshop was to really prioritize next steps in this line of work. One of the priorities that came forth was to be able to adjust the regulatory stance where eelgrass is just naturally expanding or migrating into lease areas. The hope is that by adjusting the regulation, we could remove some of the unintended incentives that exist for the industry to either not report the eelgrass or to outright remove it. There's a very clear need to quantify impacts, both positive and negative, of co-locating or near locating eelgrass in aquaculture, maybe by gear type, different farming practices, and so on. So some real applied science is needed. And then if the science does support it, it would be great to then have a regulatory framework that could enable co-location. There's even restoration potential there as well. That would really require a shift in regulatory stance. And then it's important to be able to permit and support research programs, especially those that build on collaborations between scientists, growers, and regulators, maybe even on demonstration sites. And then improving eelgrass mapping and modeling was a clear priority. Some states and provinces talked about how they don't even have a clear definition of what the meadow is and how to determine what its edge is and how to manage, how some people loosely call SAV ephemeral and, will allow uses in it because it's ephemeral or not. So with the same audience, we had discussions about what information we might want from the growers themselves, from the industry, before we move forward with any kind of management or research changes. And that's what I'll be presenting next. So in the winter of 2023, Danny and I sent out a survey to growers throughout the Gulf of Maine with a variety of questions like what would they do if eelgrass showed up on their site? What concerns do they have about engaging with science? What gear types do they think are good or bad for eelgrass, and so on. So I'll be sharing some of their perception results here. We had 45 responses, the majority of those from Massachusetts, because our outreach channels are strongest here. We were kind of relying on colleagues from other states to spread the word, but it didn't spread too far. But we had a couple of responses from many other states, including pretty far south down to North Carolina, which was surprising. So these data are definitely Massachusetts biased, but the primary species being shown in the responses was oysters, followed by quahogs, and then some less frequent species. And when asked what they would do if eelgrass appeared on their site, very encouraging to see that most would leave it alone or even alter their activity to avoid the eelgrass areas, which was wonderful. Those were the majority of the responses. It's encouraging to see that very few reported they would harvest it or remove it. Someone even had some colorful language about making a freaking salad with it. In terms of their gear types, across the respondents, there was a variety of gear types being used. There are 14 different types across that x-axis there. And there's even more than that out there in existence. These are just sort of the most common. And then in terms of how they felt each gear type affected eelgrass, that's in the bottom graphic there, where the blue bar indicates it's a beneficial, the gear beneficially has a relationship with eelgrass, or the gray is no impact on eelgrass, yellow is mixed, and red is a detrimental relationship. And not too surprisingly, the gear types that have direct contact on the bottom are flush with the bottom, were thought to be the most impactful. I was surprised to see there's even some perception that on-bottom seeding could be beneficial. And then the gear types that are slightly off the bottom, but not quite floating, definitely had less of a detrimental element to them, but still some perceived impacts there. And then you have more floating type gears, which appear to be more beneficial in their perspective. But still really looking across this whole figure here, a lot of perception that there is no impact among the gear, no impact or mixed impacts. So we thought that was pretty interesting. What concerns did the growers have about engaging? Nice to see that many had no concerns, but some of the other ones that popped up here were not too surprising, mostly around mistrust and regulation, concern about more regulations coming up through any new science, losing space on their farms, being further squeezed. And I love to see that somebody out there actually wanted to farm eelgrass. Actually, two somebodies wanted to farm eelgrass. When asked if they would consider using their lease as a demonstration site for research, 76% of them said yes or maybe. So that's also pretty encouraging. So the next thing we did after polling the industry was to then turn to the municipal shellfish constables in Massachusetts. Here we have the home rule. I'm not sure if it's that way in any of the southern states, but it's where the municipalities are the ones that are authorizing aquaculture areas. It's not the state, although the state does certify the leases. So we have a pretty unique arrangement here, and the municipal constables are critical in any work that's going to go forward. So we polled them on their perceptions of the relationship between aquaculture and eelgrass. And the way you can look at this plot is that orange bar is the effect that they felt aquaculture has on eelgrass. So the orange bar at the top, 5 of the respondents felt that aquaculture has no impact on eelgrass, as well as vice versa. A few thought that there were mixed impacts. And interestingly, several of the constables felt eelgrass would benefit aquaculture. And then interestingly, none of them thought that they would harm one another. Some of the open-ended answers that they provided in their survey responses were also really informative and just showed us how important it will be to include these constables in any work going forward. Information like eelgrass being removed from some aquaculture areas predating 1990s. That information doesn't really exist anywhere else except for in their heads. So it's so important to make sure they're part of the process. And then when asked if they would be willing to use town lease areas as demonstration sites, 53% were willing to do so. So it sounds like we have some paths forward for implementing some research here. So with all that background knowledge in hand, we delved into a research proposal idea. This is currently in NOAA's hands, where we've got fingers crossed that this will be funded. The lead on this is Diana Chin at Northeastern University, with lots of partners, including growers and constables and some others. And what we'll be doing is deploying 2 different styles of aquaculture gear in existing eelgrass that has naturally migrated onto lease areas. So we'll be putting the gear into that eelgrass and also putting the gear into newly seeded areas to just sort of try to replicate a co-culture opportunity where you're growing both intentionally. And we'll be looking for the effects of eelgrass on oysters and the effects of the oysters and the gear on eelgrass, including the metrics that you see here. So for oysters, we'll be looking at tissue, mass, shell size and condition and strength, any parasitic infections in the oysters, the biofouling rate of the gear, and then some fun consumer preference taste testing that we're looking forward to see if some of the anecdotes of oysters tasting better if they came from an eelgrass area are true. Which could help build some more social licensing for the growers and also for eelgrass. And then some of the effects on eelgrass we'll be looking for doing, routine quadrat type monitoring that we're all familiar with, canopy height, shoot count, and so on, leaf biomass, epibiont load, leaf tissue stable isotopes, sediment organic content and grain size, light, temperature, and dissolved oxygen around the cages, and then doing some drone flyovers to get a larger spatial sense of what's going on. So with that, I will say thank you, and I look forward to the question session after the talks.
Thanks so much, Jill. Great, so we'll move on now to Erin.
Hello, everyone. How's this look?
Good.
You seeing it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about a multi-year assessment of the impacts of oyster aquaculture on SAV in the Chesapeake Bay and Virginia. So currently, Virginia takes a precautionary approach to, leasing and permits that are within SAV beds. So new leases and permits are not granted in areas that have had SAV bed in any of the previous 5 years. So we have annual aerial imagery for this area. So we're able to use that data. Well, the managers are able to use that data. And it also does not allow existing leaseholders to expand into areas of their leases that have become colonized by SAV. And this approach is based on the assumption that shellfish aquaculture will have a negative impact on SAV. However, the data on this in the Chesapeake Bay is really lacking. And this map is a little bit old, from 2017, but we do see some overlap between existing leases and areas where SAV have come in and successfully established in these areas. And so if this is the case, it begs the question, are the current permitting practices too conservative? So we were funded by the Commonwealth of Virginia to collect data on this issue. So we identified 2 different commercial growers that were using floating gear, and we chose to work with floating gear as a first step because they're expected to have smaller impacts on SAV, right? And so we were able to get special research permits that allowed these growers to place their floating gear over existing SAV beds. The growers are asked to install a fully operational farm and to use their usual stocking, maintenance, and harvest practices, right? We wanted them to do what they normally do and not, operate anything differently for us. And then, we had an agreement that if negative impacts were observed, that we would work together with the growers to collaborate and develop, new approaches to eliminate or reduce the impacts. So this map is intentionally vague, but the 2 farms, one is on the western shore of the bay and one's on the eastern shore, on the bay side of the eastern shore. They're operated very differently. So the western shore farm is using these single floating bags that are attached to a line. And if you can see here, there's no spacing between the bags on the line, and the lines are relatively close together. I could not drive a boat through these lanes. The lines are too close together for that. The Eastern Shore farm is using these floating cages with 6 bags per cage. There's significant spacing between the cages on the line, and the lines are relatively far apart. I could always comfortably drive a boat through the lanes of this farm. So first, I'm going to talk about the Western Shore design. So we identified a site for the farm establishment and then 3 adjacent control areas. Originally this was an area that had shown a lot of grass there on the aerial images in the past. However, of course, the year that this project started in 2019, there was no grass there. However, it did come in, it came back in 2020. So we were able to keep this site. And so we sampled farm and controls a few times in 2020, 4 times in 2021, and then 3 times in 2022. The species here are rupia or widgeon grass and also horn pondweed or Xanachelia. So these first plots are showing rupia and percent. I'm reporting on percent cover. We took a whole suite of measurements. I'm just talking about percent cover here. So we did see significant differences in rupia percent cover between the control and the farm. This first graph is just comparing straight control plots versus farm plots. The second graph, we were interested in looking at kind of the perimeter of the farm and seeing if we could see, smaller scale impacts of the grass when you moved directly outside the farm, as opposed to the controls, which are a bit farther away. And so for both of those, we did see significantly less rupia within the farm boundaries. You kind of see this from this drone imagery where, there's very little grass within this farm. And then right when you get outside the farm, it starts to pick up in coverage. . kind of saw opposite results for horn pondweed. Now, this species in the Chesapeake Bay only comes in the spring, so it was only present for our spring sampling, and then it's gone in the summer. So that's why you see these spring peaks here. And we really only saw it this 1 year in any kind of abundance, and we actually saw that it was more abundant within the farm compared to the controls. You know, I think this was a product of it being released from competition from rupia, because we really didn't see rupia growing within the farm, and so horn pondweed potentially, you know, took advantage of that. But you know, we can't really say for sure. And unfortunately, this Western Shore farm was really results are really confounded by the farm maintenance. So we had all kinds of issues with this farm working with these growers. This image, these are all drone images. This one here is from, you know, the spring of 2021, when we saw a lot of horn pondweed in the farm. The cages were allowed to sink, and they got too heavy. They were allowed to sink, and since they're on a floating line, one part of the cage would sink, and then the line would float, and the cages would just drag along the bottom and cause these scars that you see here. And so we found that, you know, potentially these floating lines can actually cause more damage than on bottom if they're allowed to sink and drag like this. And, you know, the SAV in the Chesapeake Bay grows very shallow. So all of these farms are placed, you know, in very shallow areas where this potential to drag is there. You know, we did address this with the growers, and they floated their cages again, but, you know, we continue to go back and see, you can see all these sunken cages, and then the lines would just come together and meet, and there really weren't any lanes anymore. So we weren't able to continue working with this farm anymore. So conclusions for the Western Shore farm. We did see significant negative farm scale impacts on widgeon grass, but the results are confounded by poor farm maintenance. All right, so moving on to the Eastern Shore farm. This farm was established in June and July of 2019. The growers decided where they were going to put the farm, so they ended up putting it in the densest part of the grass bed. And so, and this is eelgrass dominated. There's a little bit of widgeon grass on the shoreward sides of the plots, but what I'm going to be showing is for eelgrass. And so the way we dealt with the fact that they put the farm in the really dense part of the bed was we developed this paired before-after control impact design. So originally, this whole area was farm, and this whole area was control. And what we worked with the growers to actually move part, after we were able to sample for a couple of years, move part of the farm over into the control. And so we had two pairs of treatments. The first, what we're calling impact, is the removal of aquaculture gear. So we had a farm to farm treatment that has, you know, always had aquaculture gear over it, and a farm to control treatment where the aquaculture gear was removed from that farm, and we continue to measure it. And then we have the impact of the addition of aquaculture gear. So we have a control plot that was started as control and remained control. And then we have a control to farm plot, which started as control and then had aquaculture gear moved on top of it. And so before this move, we were able to sample in 2019, 3 times in 2020, and then the spring of 2021, and then the farm was moved, and we were able to sample through the fall of this last year. So a lot of really good before and after data there. And so this is eelgrass percent cover, and what we're looking for with this, you know, paired Backy designs are the relationship between the two. Does it change, you know, before the farm establishment and before the farm was removed? So on top, we have the control sites that before farm establishment were control, and then after farm establishment were still control. And we're comparing that to the control to farm sites in green that had a farm placed over it halfway through our study. And we saw no significant interaction between the treatment and the before after establishment there. So we saw no impacts of placing a farm on top of the control. And the bottom graph is showing the farm plots and what happened when we removed cages, aquaculture gear from part of the farm. And again, we saw no significant interaction between the farm impact and the before after movement of the farm. And we also looked at canopy height, macroalgae percent cover, and those all show the same results, no significant impacts. So where we did see some impacts is when we kind of zoom into the micro scale of looking at the actual farm gear. And so this is showing results just for that farm to farm treatment. So the area of the farm that always had cages over it for the whole time period. Within that farm, we took samples underneath the cage, underneath the rope that connects the cages, and then also within the lanes. And we compared those over time. And in 2022, we did see significant impacts from the cages and a little bit from the rope, but not quite as extreme compared to the lane. However, by 2023, these these impacts were gone. The cage, grass was able to grow back. So we did see full recovery by the next year. And when I looked at the tide data, we did see the lowest tides of the whole time period in the spring of that year of 2022. And when we look at this drone imagery, you can kind of see some, evidence of cages, like these bare areas under the cages. So we think that during those low tides, some of these cages were actually resting on the bottom and potentially dragging a little bit. However, it didn't have a lasting impact on the grass there. So in conclusions for the Eastern Shore Farm, again, we only saw reduced SAV under cages in 1 year. Farm scale impacts, we found no significant farm scale impacts. And this farm was designed to minimize any potential impacts because the cages only cover about 6% of the total farm footprint, which is very different from the Western Shore Farm. So conclusions and future work. These studies highlight the need for a nuanced approach, which makes it difficult when you're trying to give recommendations to the managers, right? This shows that the farm gear and the maintenance, as well as the SAV species, really matters. And a one-size-fits-all approach is probably not going to work here. We also need a lot more research into rupia, widgeon grass. This has become the dominant species in the bay. It's expanding in a lot of areas. And unfortunately, our study was confounded by the farm maintenance. So we have identified another farm to work with that has rupia, and we're going to be starting sampling there next month, actually. And so, due to the very narrow depth range and shallow depths in which both of these species grow in the Chesapeake Bay, any possible negative aquaculture impacts can be reduced or eliminated by placing the farm in deeper depths, just a little bit deeper depths, where there will either be no direct interactions or where the cages themselves will never be resting on the bottom, even at the lowest tides. All right, I just want to thank the collaborating growers and other members of the aquaculture industry that have provided advice and suggestions over these years. And our funding was provided by the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then there's my email, or Dr. Lisa Kellogg, who is going to continue to be the PI on this project if you have any questions or comments. So thank you.
Great job. Thank you both so much. Before we get to questions, for those that maybe hopped on late, put your name and affiliation in the chat, just a little bit of housekeeping there. But now we've got some time till 11 o'clock for questions. So for both Jill and Aaron, based on their work with the aquaculture gear and SAV, I know you've got them. Janelle.
Hi, great talks, both of you. I have a question for Aaron on your Eastern Shore farms. It almost looked like there was a little bit of a confounding site effect where the sites that started as farms had higher SAV growth overall, or SAV cover. How long had those farms been in place before you started monitoring and before you switched from farm to control? And do you think that that was just a natural site difference, or do you think the presence of the farms had any effect on that?
Yeah, so we were able to monitor one time before the farm was placed. So that was June 2019. And then the farm was placed, and the area that they placed it on was the densest part of the bed. And so we were concerned about that. But so we were able to kind of pivot and turn it into this paired, before after impact design. And so for 2019, 2020, and the spring of 2021, we were able to measure it the way that they had placed the farm. And then we had them move a portion of the farm into the control plot. And then we were able to continue our same measurements through 2021, 2022, and 2023. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, just that you were able to get out there before, and that was historically the densest part of the eelgrass bed, even
Yes,
before the
we
farm
did.
came in, it sounds like.
Yeah, we did take measurements, and we can also see from, years of aerial imagery as well. But we did find a significant, that the eelgrass growing within where they put the farm was significantly greater than in the controls before they put the farm in. And so that was our concern with continuing with just that experimental design. And that's why we shifted to kind of the paired, what happens if you remove a farm, what happens if you add a farm.
Thanks. Judd?
Right. Thanks a lot. Those were both wonderful talks. I'll direct my question to Jill, but I think it's a question for Aaron too. And Jill mentioned that you mentioned that you have a pending proposal with NOAA to work. My question is, I guess for you, and Aaron could chime in too, is what kind of time horizon do you think we need to really understand this interaction, and how confident do you feel that the work you're proposing is in that time horizon?
That's a great question, Jed. Thank you. We need more time and more space than we can get in a 2-year grant. I know that for sure. So we're going into this proposal and this project knowing that it's just a springboard to the other things that we need to do. I mean, we need to test this at scale the way Aaron is doing. There are so many challenges to doing that in Massachusetts. It'll take us 2 to 3 years to get through permitting, to permit an existing eelgrass bed that does not currently have a farm on it. So we're limited right now to only using existing farms that happen to have eelgrass growing onto them, which is not necessarily what we're after. We also want to look at truly co-locating a dense, healthy eelgrass bed with a new farm. So there's the spatial component, and like you said, the time component too, because often these leases are 5, 10 plus years. I mean, up in New Brunswick, they said it's up to a 20-year term, which is a very long time to operate a farm. So a small 2-year study is not really getting at the continued chronic impacts that the farm is having year after year.
Aaron, did you want to add to that?
I think Jill said it nicely. We're fortunate that, we've got state money to look at this year after year. And so we did have 5 years of data from that Eastern Shore farm. And, through that, we were able to see impacts in just one of the years and then track from the cages themselves and then track the recovery. And so I think that's important because, like Jill said, these leases are longer term than typically what we're able to study. So
Thanks. Zach.
Thank you.
Yeah, great presentations. My question is for Aaron. I'd be curious to hear more about that permitting process because I'm kind of more in the boat where I see it as a huge issue that impedes research. So I just am curious to hear what the regulators in Virginia were like to work with and how you were able to get this project going in such a dense eelgrass bed.
yeah, great question. This was driven by the state and the regulators. So they wanted us to do this project. And so because of that, it was a, easier process than I think if you were just coming up with your own research project and wanted to get it regulated that way. So this is a huge political issue here. Over the past 5 years, it continues to be. So there was a lot of want and need from regulators to get these studies underway.
Thanks. And I'll note in the chat that Jill dropped the link to the workshop there. Chris.
Oop, I'm muted. So I was curious, like Aaron in particular, but also like Jill, I'm sorry I missed your talk. I was late to the meeting. We've been doing some similar work in the coastal bays for clam aquaculture. And same political issue. And one of the things that has been proposed is whether like rotation of locations is perhaps like a good idea. So like right now we're forcing the aquaculturists to basically stay put. And if the grass grows around them, then they really have to stay put because like they're in like an island of places where they can't move their plots, even though they often do. But so there's been this suggestion of, well, maybe, like every 2 years or every 3 years, like they move their plots. And so they're kind of spreading the damage out, but they're giving areas an opportunity to regrow. Based on what you were seeing with like the 5-year data, Aaron, like, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, that kind of model?
Yeah, I mean, from our Eastern Shore 5-year data, I think, it shows really well that if the farm is being maintained properly and the cages are actually floating all the time, then it's fine. It's not, you wouldn't need to rotate in that example.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't think. Yeah, I guess my concern would be like if you get a farm like the Western Shore farm, and that the Western Shore farm to me is so concerning because we were working with them. They had a special research permit. They knew we were coming out there repeatedly in order to make recommendations based on their farm practices, and they still didn't, it was still like dragging all over the bed and a mess. So there's such a caveat here to that Eastern Shore farm. It's like, well, yeah, these can coexist. You can do it properly, but like, what's the mechanism in place to make sure that these growers are doing it properly? So I guess if you were recommending like a farm like the Western Shore farm to move every couple of years, then you're potentially having them damage just more and more and more beds when you don't know if it's going to actually recover. So yeah, I don't know, Chris. So that's interesting.
Yeah, no, and you raised a good point about like the monitoring enforcement, right? Because even if we make some regulations that we think will be protective of grass and allow coexistence, You know, the precautionary approach would be like, if we can't enforce it, then maybe we shouldn't, you know, offer those regulations up because, you know, it won't actually have the intended consequences. Thanks.
Jesse?
Yeah, Jill, I have a question for you. Your survey results were really interesting. In particular, sort of I like the idea. I love that you guys did the aquaculturists, but then also like the managers and the towns. And it seemed like there was actually more of a willingness to work with scientists from the growers than from the town. So I was just curious, like, what do you think drove that, and how can we maybe work on that?
I noticed that too, and in talking sort of informally with some of them, calling them, looking for, you know, how places and locations for the research project, I got that sense as well. I have to say it's more of a demographic thing, I think, with them. It's often, you know, older retirees. They kind of have a nice, pleasant job. They're not exactly looking to get into some controversial waters with people. And that was a stance that we were hearing a lot, is like, I don't think my growers are like that. I'm not going to do that. But, and, you know, we would say, actually, I think there is a lot of interest among the growers. But so there was definitely some pushback there. And I think they, you know, they like to keep everyone kind of happy, and not, some more than others, were willing to push, you know, push the envelope on into the uncharted territory and trying something new.
How much control do they have over permitting outside of their township? Because you said it's different than a lot of what I understand. So are the towns folks the ones that are signing off on all? Okay. Interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the actual lease area has to get certified by a state agency, by our Division of Marine Fisheries. And they're just looking at other conflicting fishery uses and habitats. So they'll look at historic habitat maps and things like that. But it is the town making the first and the final call on whether an aquaculturist gets a lease, how much of the water body gets parsed up, and all of that. So it's interesting. They are, I mean, I think they see themselves as already the top of the chain, and they're, you know, as the regulator. And I think they don't see a lot of need to change or improve.
Thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Dick?
Yeah, I was wondering if you had done anything about thinking about the labor costs associated with some of your recommendations. Like, how much more does it cost them to move the farms into slightly deeper water? And how much is it costing them, for example, to maintain the ropes and floating lines versus just letting them drag on the bottom there? And how does that affect, any idea how that affects their bottom line? Because, you know, whatever happens, ultimately, they've got to be able to make a profit on this, or they go out of business.
Yeah, great question. You know, that's not really my area of expertise, but we did, you know, ask them to operate the farm the way that they normally would, you know, if they got their normal permit where there was no grass there. And so I think their product, I think, you know, they want them to stay floating. And the whole point is, of those floating cages for them is, I think they're getting a better product that way too. And a lot of growers have moved to those floating cages, not because of the grass impact, but because it is in some ways easier to maintain. It might be more expensive to set up originally, you know, but I think it is easier to maintain, and they're getting a better product from it. So I think that they're internally incentivized to operate that way, regardless of the SAV question. But if anyone knows more about that than me, feel free to chime in.
Well, and what about going into deeper water? Any ideas about how much that's going to increase their cost? Because they're not going to be able to walk out there. They're going to have to use boats and floats and other things.
Yeah, so the Eastern Shore Farm only harvests by boat. Nobody's walking around out there. In fact, they'd see us out there in March in our wetsuits and be like, "You guys are crazy. Like, why are you in the water?" So for an operation like that, it wouldn't, you know, that wouldn't be an issue. And so I always bring this up. I'm like, why can't, if you moved your farm like just a little bit offshore, you would be out of the grass bed. What what I typically hear back from, managers and stuff is the public has, well, there's navigational issues. And then it becomes a lot of times more unsightly. Like more people can see your stuff if you're moving it out towards channels. And then the navigational issues is what has been said to me.
I think, Judd, you'll be our last question for this bit of time. If you want to take us
All
out.
right. Thank you. Direct this to Aaron, but you mentioned in your talk, you were talking about the precautionary principle early on, and then you mentioned that the regulators don't allow farms in areas where the seagrass has been documented the last 5 years. And I'm wondering how they came to using 5 years as opposed to any other time window in thinking about the variability in these systems and how cover changes and grass beds move around. And we're dealing with the same thing in North Carolina too. So Charlie might speak about that a little bit in his talk.
Yeah, Judd, that's been in place for a long time. Chris, I don't know if you know about this, but I think that came from JJ's, original data where he was working with, our state regulators and trying to come up with that number. And how exactly they came to 5 years, I don't know, but I could follow up on that with you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a question for JJ. He may have pulled the number out of a hat. I think Aaron's right. There could have been some sort of logic, like if we haven't seen it for 5 years, probability of it coming back is pretty low.
He did some deer stuff, didn't he? He did some deer impact studies. So I hope it came from that.
I'm sure there's some science behind it, yes.
We'll cite that later. I'm sure there was some science behind that. All right, well, if there are no other questions, then we will move on. So our next set of talks are looking at some of those perspectives on regulations and the aquaculture perspective. Maybe Zach has an idea on the floating gear. He can give us that perspective as well. So first up is Charlie Deaton looking at the North Carolina regulation perspective. So Charlie, you have the floor.
Alrighty, are you seeing my slides?
That we are, yes.
Great. So yeah, my name is Charlie Deaton. I work for North Carolina's Division of Marine Fisheries in our Habitat and Enhancement section. And I'll throw out that our section is special in that we have both our habitat protection and our shellfish leasing and aquaculture team in the same section, sharing the same offices. Our technicians are split between habitat protection and shellfish lease investigations. So we work really closely here. And I'll give a shout out to Owen, our previous leasing coordinator, for a lot of the slides that I'm going to share with you today. So I'm just going to go through real quick. I'm going to apologize in advance that I have far too many slides for a 15-minute presentation. So I'm going to blast through things, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask me later. But I'm going to talk about SAV and shellfish leases in North Carolina. I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on the background and the regulatory process of shellfish leases. And then I'm going to try to get into some examples and some science and observations that have been done in North Carolina around SAV and leases, and some conclusions on how that's informed how we manage SAV and in our lease application process. So this is probably old news for a lot of you, but to speak in broad brushstrokes, North Carolina's SAV is split between our high salinity species on our back barrier flats, and those tend to be wide, shallow meadows, whereas our low salinity species are shoreline fringing on our inner coast, which is mostly drowned river valleys. So there's not a lot of depth for them to form the wide areas that they form in the back barrier region. And in our high salinity zone, we're mostly zoster, haliduli, and rupia, and it gets more diverse in low salinity. But for the most part, our shellfish leases are concentrated in our high salinity area with a little bit of overlap in bits of the Western Pamlico shoreline. And this is just a Rhode Island for scale, just so that you have a concept of our staffing to shoreline ratio is maybe not the same as a lot of other states here. So these are our shellfish growing areas in North Carolina. These are determined by our shellfish sanitation section, which is also part of our Division of Marine Fisheries. This is mostly based on if water quality is good enough to eat raw shellfish from the water. So it also tracks kind of the freshwater growability line. It's most of these red areas that you're seeing, especially in the northern part of the state, are just too fresh to grow oysters. And most of the product grown in North Carolina are oysters. We do have hard clams, a few who do bay scallops. Those are both leases and wild harvest. So North Carolina's allowed shellfish leases since the 1850s. And in 1989, the legislature created the ability to do water column leases. So previously, bottom leases only, which are limited to the bottom plus 18 inches off the bottom. And then in 2019, well, most of the late 2010s, there were new regulations that tried to look at how to expand leasing while addressing user conflicts. So knowing this audience, just wanted to throw this slide to saying, you know, we do see a lot of benefits to our state from shellfish leasing. And comparing leasing and wild harvesting areas, wild harvest has been declining at the same time that leases have been increasing since the mid 2010s. And so there's other things going on, but there's some thought that leases are releasing pressure on the wild oyster resource. So, you know, that's another accessory benefit of having these leases, of kind of reducing pressure on our historically overfished natural reefs. Lease really exploded again starting 2016, 2017. We were handling about 10 lease applications per year, spiking into the 30s to 50s, and it's continued to stay at this fairly sustained high level. We have, like I said, both water column and bottom leases. Bottom leases are doing a mix of bottom cages and just coastal deployment, whereas our water column leases are kind of our most intensive gear use. This is just a breakdown kind of how they're distributed. Acreage wise, we've got, so, and I'm going to back up and say that this, for our bottom and water column leases, acreages are duplicative. So a leaseholder has to have a bottom lease in order to have a water column lease. So all water column leases have a bottom lease, but not all bottom leases have a water column lease. So anyway, we're working with about, let's say, 2,000 acres worth of leases. And franchises are in here. We don't grant franchises anymore. That's because we're only allowed on submerged land claims that were acknowledged back in the 80s. So those can only decrease over time. They won't increase. And those, for context, cover less than 1/10 of North Carolina's coastal habitat area. So to help applicants, our section developed a shellfish leasing interactive tool. I'm happy to share the link in the chat if anybody would like to browse it. But we basically put together all of our relevant GIS layers, including mapped seagrass, mapped waterways, navigational channels, that kind of thing. And to help our applicants put in leases or propose leases that are going to be able to make it through successfully all of our guidelines. So one of the keys here that I wanted to highlight is our leases are limited to between 1/2 acre and 10 acres, and no shellfish leaseholder can hold or have interest in more than 50 acres. So have interest in includes having family members, so, or direct family members. So you can't have a husband and wife who each have 50 acres. They'd be limited to 50 total. So the focus of this was try to keep shellfish leasing in small business territory, keep it from getting big. And this is, we have a lot of different agencies that comment when our leases come to proposal, and I'm kind of giving away the conclusion here, but one of the requirements that we have in agreement with the Army Corps is that a lease site can have no more than 15% coverage of SAV, which came about a little bit as response to trying to figure out how to negotiate conflicting federal and state laws here. So in North Carolina, we are banned from excluding an area from leasing solely on the basis that an area contains SAV. Now, federal permits obviously supersede state law, so federal permits allowed initially no SAV at all, and then to kind of, there's instances where it had been granted and things hadn't been done well, but so we came up with a protocol that tried to satisfy everyone involved, and that protocol is it's here. It's so for water depths that are less than 5 feet, 15% or less of samples taken during the shellfish lease investigation process are allowed to have SAV, and the density within those samples has to be very sparse, 10% coverage of the sample or less. And then there's a slight increase allowed to the number of samples for deeper water. In addition, if there's any SAV detected on the lease, there are additional conditions put on the lease that the leaseholder has to follow. No bottom disturbing gear, which means these two are related. So basically you can't dump culch out on the lease, because most culch users are then coming in with a dredge or other mechanical gear later to harvest the oysters once they've grown out to size. So the investigation progress we have a bunch of things that have to be investigated once an applicant has applied for a lease. They're all listed here, but the key to SAV and shellfish that are existing on the lease is we take 25 samples per acre. This is a lease on the back side of Bogue Banks that our crew did, and this is just what that 25 samples per acre looks like once it's distributed over a roughly 5-acre lease. And when they're out there, they're using 1 square meter hydraulic patent tongs. So they open up to a depth to a 1 square meter size, then close in and pull that up to the surface. And these are both samples that would have failed. So too much seagrass in one, or having any extent of live shellfish in the other. And I include this slide mostly just to highlight that we're not giving these away like candy. There's a long, intensive process that requires comment from multiple sections of DEQ, plus the Army Corps, NOAA, and others. And then that's all before it goes to DMF's director, who has, if it gets through all of those stages, then has the decision of whether to approve it for public hearing, and then after that, whether to give it final approval for the leaseholder to actually get the lease put gear out there. So figured I'd show a few examples of where we do have SAV in our leases and what that looks like from a remote sensing perspective. So these are screenshots from our shellfish leasing tool. So this is the backside of Ocracoke Island, where some of our noted conflicts have been. This is a zoom in of one of the leases, and with that lease removed, this is one where it's hard to tell that this is the bottom lease only. It has a water column lease proposed for it, and that's been an issue that has that one's getting addressed separately. That's kind of external to what I want to cover today, but interesting to note that there's lots of bottom gear out there, but from a 50,000 foot perspective, it's hard to see that it's even there. The seagrass is growing around it. This area, Nelson Bay out by sea level, this is back on mainland Carteret County, is an area that we've also noticed some conflicts. So zooming into this one here on the western shoreline, in this, the dark green at the top is an active water column lease. The blue and the light green at the bottom are a current bottom lease with a proposed water column for part of that bottom lease. And part of that is because the SAV covers part of that bottom lease. So what our biologists and technicians in consultation with this leaseholder, when they came to us applying for that water column lease, asked for them to cut the part of the bottom lease that contains the SAV out of their proposed water column lease to keep that gear out in the open. So, and I also share this because up at the top, that active water column lease, this is one of our most intensively used leases. Most growers in North Carolina are not getting anywhere close to capacity of what they could if they chose fill their gear with leases. And I think there's a whole host of reasons to go into that between the labor and marketability, but you know, just as a highlight that this is one of our most intensive sites. These are areas where to get a boat between the lines of bags here, you'd have to move them to the side probably. So in DMF's 2017 hard clam fishery management plan, which is developed alongside our oyster plan, this issue just got stuck under hard clam. Did a review of studies and found mixed results, as you know, the previous presenters have highlighted. So part of that resulted in a recommendation for further funding to look into the SAV and leases issue. And you know, so this is one project that happened on the backside of Hatteras, led by Joel Fodry, and they found impacts to SAV that were negative, but seagrass was still able to grow or even expand in the presence of culture gear, just at reduced rates compared to neighboring control sites. They also looked at fish communities in the SAV and found that having the oyster culture gear resulted in a net enhancement of fisheries habitat value. So even though there were slight negative impacts to the SAV noted, it was noted that the habitat quality from a fish perspective overall was increased. And I'll note that this is an interim report and there's research ongoing here. So we've continued to have questions arise about potential impacts between these two. So this is some ongoing preliminary work that I've been doing on the side using some of AFNEP's data. Thanks, Tim. I think he's here on the call. And I have not had a chance to discuss this with Tim, so there's going to be a lot of caveats to this research. But anyway, this is, again, very preliminary, looking at AFNEP's 2013 and 2020 surveys. Of all of our shellfish leases, there are a total of 10 that overlapped both the seagrass observed in both 2013 and 2020. The lease size here was an average of just over 3 acres. Some of these, like the one I highlighted earlier, were completely covered with SAV, and some of them only had a corner that happened to overlap SAV. And there were others that had SAV in one year, but not the other. But and there's things to be drawn from that, but that's not part of the analysis I've had a chance to get to yet. But this was just a comparison straight up of lease that overlapped SAV in 2013 and 2020, and with a arbitrary 150-meter buffer around it. And within that focal area, there was, regardless of whether it was within the lease or the buffer, there was loss of SAV. That was pretty much statewide. And the loss was on the order of 20% in leases versus 11% in the buffer surrounding the lease. And AFNEP also breaks things down in terms of continuous versus patchy SAV in these large-scale spatial surveys. And again, across the area, this was maybe a little unexpected. Things went from patchy to continuous. Things, the SAV seemed to fill in a little bit. And that increase in fill in continuous area was greater in the buffers than the leases. Comparing water column and bottom leases generally had the same trends, except for water column lease SAV extent actually increased, where it had decreased on bottom leases. So, a bunch of caveats here. This is a very small sample size, and these surveys are just snapshots. SAV changes a lot from year to year, and this is one snapshot on 2013 and one in 2020. And generally, it fared better in the buffer around the leases than within the leases, but it was still able to fill in. So we kind of found similar results to what the Fadre and Morley study found, that there's a slight negative impact, but SAV can persist and fill in or grow. But counter to their research, we found that it was expanding in water column leases when it was declining in other areas. So again, this fits into this theme of research on this issue, where it's kind of difficult to pin down a straightforward impact. And this last comment goes to kind of my management takeaways here, where these leases covered about 33 acres, and North Carolina has about 195,000 acres of historical SAV habitat. So we're talking about impacts to a very small portion of the state's SAV area. And in part, that's because we try to balance protection of SAV and use of our waterways with this 15% sparse SAV threshold, right? So we're, for the most part, except where some mistakes and slip-ups happened pre-2015, most of these leases that are proposed to cover seagrass are rejected these days. So we generally are not seeing an increase in leases over SAV. So that's kind of a quick overview of how we're balancing. And that's all I've got. So if anybody, I don't know if we want to have questions now or if we're holding them for later, but that's all I got.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, we'll do questions after our break. Thank you so much. And next we've got Zach. So Zach's coming from the NOAA Northeast Regional Aquaculture Liaison. Take it away.
Yeah, so thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so I'm going to be a little bit more casual. I don't have a presentation. Z just gave me a couple prompts to talk about. So I'll first start by kind of giving a little background on my position. I am like she said, the regional aquaculture liaison for the NOAA Fisheries Milford Lab. The Milford Lab is a shellfish aquaculture, federally funded and staffed shellfish aquaculture research lab in Milford, Connecticut. We've done research over the years on all types of shellfish that are grown commercially in the Northeast, and we really pride ourselves in being reactive to what the industry needs. So part of the reason I was brought in is to kind of work with the industry extension in the region to kind of get a real good understanding of what the industry needs are, and then bring that back to the scientists at the lab to do research on those types of topics. So when it comes to SAV, my stakeholders are really the aquaculture industry. So I'm going to give a little perspective on what some of the aquaculture industry's concerns are in the Northeast, and what research I think would be valuable for them to see or participate in. So a lot of this stuff has already been covered, and one of the most thorough investigations of this was done by Jill and Danny, MIT Sea Grant and Mass Bays. So really happy to see that presentation. So they were able to really do a good job covering Massachusetts, but every state in the Northeast is different when it comes to regulations, when it comes to aquaculture practices, and the amount of seagrass seen in each state. So I think it's really good to get the perspective kind of on a broader scale. And what we're seeing with farmers in the Northeast is that concern on the regulation side of things. And I don't think it's necessarily that they want to put their farms in areas where there is eelgrass. I think it more tends to be there's a lot of interest and effort to restore eelgrass beds in the Northeast. And if we do a really good job restoring these beds and they start encroaching on farms that are already in existence, how will that affect them? And is there a chance their farms will get revoked or be told to move? And in some, isolated cases, this has happened, and it's caused kind of a scare for some of the industry. So I think really understanding, how farms either benefit or impact, and the gear types and the best practices for managing, eelgrass in your area are things that really need to be researched. So, if you start seeing eelgrass in your area, are there things you can do on your farm to help promote that, to not impact it, and such and so forth. So I think, that type of the research I've seen from you guys has been really interesting, and I'm really happy to be here. And I would really like to see some more research on, on these restoration efforts in the Northeast. If there's aquaculture in the area, can that be beneficial to some of these restoration efforts? Is the water quality impact make any difference? Not just in the direct area of the farm, but surrounding the farm area, and those kinds of things. So I'm happy to just kind of be a part of this discussion and take any questions about what the industry thinks, and ask some questions, because I really enjoyed Charlie's talk, and I actually have some questions for him as well. So yeah, just quick and to the point.
Thanks, Zach. So that was obviously one of the efforts, was to kind of combine both the scientist SAV perspective in addition to the industry side and the aquaculture perspective for that. So we are a bit ahead of schedule. So maybe what I'll do now is, before we take the break, I do want to put up the poll, because this is the idea for anyone that's part of the EC SAV collaborative. So those that are official members, this is maybe the membership perk, is that you can vote on the next topic. So you should see a poll in front of you. These are for the order for the last two topics. I was gonna say, do you see the poll? But people are voting, so that's good. So what I want to do is we'll do the poll, and then maybe we're ahead of schedule, so maybe come back in 10 minutes. So at 11:33, this is your bio break, and come back to merge these ideas. So we've seen the science, and we've had some introductions from our regulators. And so we'll come back at 11:33 to then have open dialogue, open questions from both our science presenters as well as regulatory folks. Or if you just want to hang around, you can certainly hang around, but
Z, is that a little fireplace behind you?
Totally is.
Oh,
it's
that's so
going.
sweet.
And it's totally going because it's cold here.
I love that.
And I'm a total wuss because it's cold and that it's 47. You wouldn't know that I moved here from Miami, but like 10 years ago, but
Been chilly up here too. I'm ready for real spring.
Me too. I also just turned on my heat. So. Hey Jill, I hope you don't mind. We posted and it's already up. We posted the link to your YouTube to the workshop that you gave us, if that's right.
Yep, that's great.
Thank you. It's somewhere on the resources page. I'm not sure where Caitlin put it, but somewhere up there.
It's under the policy part.
Okay. Cool. Thanks. I'm digging it.
she's fast, that Caitlin. She's on top of it.
Indeed.
And then, yes, if you, Jill and Aaron, if you guys can send your presentation file. And whatever version you're willing to share, if there's anything on there that you're not ready to share. And we'll post that. Same thing with Charlie, if you can send your file, that'd be great. Thank you. All right, welcome back. Are we ready? I feel like the big reveal, as if it was like an election of anything. It matters to us. It matters to us. So, drum roll, share results. So the next topic up to bat will be living shorelines, aka nature-based solutions, and interactions with SAV. And then after that will be mitigation. So how it works for those that are maybe visiting us or first time. So we'll have a steering committee meeting where we kind of flesh out what that looks like, what direction we'll want to take that, and then pick dates and things like that, and the speaker panel, whatever. If there's a survey we do in advance, kind of when we did the Sentinel site, right? We gathered data in advance and then had a deliverable. So we just have the topic. That's step one. Step two will be to develop the rest of it. So living shorelines and then mitigation. So, we had our four presenters. So, Zach, we'll start with you. You mentioned you were gunning for Charlie.
Yeah, I'm really happy to see, like, I work with a lot of regulators in the Northeast up here, and they're not so open to working, on these issues. So it's really nice to see North Carolina is kind of at the forefront. I'd be curious to hear if there have been any farms that were established and then eelgrass started showing up, and what the reaction would be, from the regulators if something like that happened.
Sure. So I think, like I mentioned, in AppNup's survey, I briefly mentioned this, where what I showed was just leases where we had SAV in 2013 and 2020. There were somewhere it appeared in 2020 where it hadn't previously been surveyed, and we know that happens outside of the survey areas too. So that's the thing that happens. And from our perspective, I mean, from my perspective as a regulator, if SAV is showing up in a lease where it wasn't previously, that seems like it's a good thing. And we have no reason to do anything about that, really. We also have no mechanism to do that. So once a lease is granted, it is a 10-year lease. And I believe if the applicant applies to renew the lease at the end of the 10 years, we do not do another lease investigation. Because if any SAV or natural oysters have shown up during the lease, that would maybe suggest that the lease isn't negatively impacting them. So that's my quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, that was kind of going to be my follow-up, because a lot of lease terms up here are shorter, 5-year terms or something like that, and then they do the whole process again. So it sounds like you don't do that up there. Or down.
Right. And some of that is that we have enough growers who use culch on bottom. Obviously not in the leases with SAV since we don't allow that, but on other leases that at that point you'd be sampling oysters that had grown on culch that they had left on the bottom. So it would look like a natural oyster reef at that point.
Other questions? Judd?
Thanks. My video isn't working for some reason. The camera light went off, but great talks. Charlie, thanks for your talk. I have a whole bunch of questions, but we can do that offline since we're neighbors. But one thing I was wondering about for Charlie was there was a time in the leasing program where they considered the historical record of SAV occurring when they were considering a particular lease. And of course, now we have all these really good maps that go back to 2006. And I didn't see that as one of the components in the decision tree. So does the decision actually rely just on that particular investigation survey you do, or is there any element of historical extent considered?
Yes, so what I'm sharing right now is our shellfish leasing tool. This is what we, all our prospective growers use this to create their proposed leases. And so what's included here is our mosaic of all the SAV that's been mapped since 1981. And this is not, so technically a grower can say like, hey, I've gone out to the field and this area that's been mapped as having SAV, I don't see any there. I'm going to propose my lease here. And if our technicians go out, they investigate it, and they don't hit SAV or they don't hit the threshold for the that 15% threshold, then we'll still grant them that lease. But when applicants are coming, the advice that the shellfish lease coordinator gives them is if you apply, avoid these areas. If you go out there, they're most likely going to have seagrass in them because that's been the case. Most people aren't applying in the areas that had SAV in the 80s and don't have it anymore. Those areas are just kind of further away. Most of the areas that people are applying that have been mapped as having SAV still have it. And that's been somewhat by chance, but they are highly discouraged from applying for leases in these areas, mostly because it's highly likely that the application will fail.
Thanks.
Tim?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, my question's for Charlie. Charlie, in your assessment that you shared earlier, did your conclusions factor in whether or not these leases were operational? And I ask because that Ocracoke lease that you spoke about, and then anyway, that one, we have evidence from our aerial surveys that lease has not had gear in it for the last 15 years. Yet the SAV is moved in that area considerably. So I think I'd just like some clarification if your conclusions were drawn from leases that are actually working or operating versus leases that were approved but then never.
Yeah, so that's something that I have tried to quickly look at, and no, that I did not break that out at all. So if that lease in particular, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important because you're 33% or 33 acres. There needs to be some clarification on that.
I apologize. I put that in there, and I realized as I was saying that was probably a little misleading, both because it doesn't include, this was only the double survey overlap. There's more acreage than that, and there's caveats as to what on the other end, what amount of those leases are actually worked. So I don't have a good way of quickly quantifying that, but I will throw out that lease. Anyway, we can have an offline discussion about that lease, because I know that there's some ongoing questions about that one. But yeah, so looking at the leases from my perspective without going into their aquaculture permits and their production reports, I don't have a way of validating how much use a lease has had. But that is certainly an area that would be good to go forward with this. And yeah, I'd love to talk to you more offline in terms of what directions this analysis can go.
Yeah, it's just important for the group to understand that some of these leases, grass may be moving in there because there's no lease operation to begin with. They're approved leases, but they're just not being used. And then just a couple other comments. So you noted that the cover class was changing from 2013 survey to the 2020 survey. From the continuous cover class was increasing and patchy was decreasing in the areas you looked at. I just want to clarify for the group that as a whole for our North Carolina's SAV resource, we're seeing the exact opposite. The cover class is continuing to shift to patchy with less continuous coverage for that about 100 acres that we're mapping every so often. And then the last thing is, while we're not seeing a lot of leases being approved directly over top of SAV, we are seeing more leases being approved in our dense continuous SAV areas, and these leases are popping up in the spots where there is no SAV, but they're surrounded on all four sides by large meadows. So the only way to get to those beds day in and day out for operation is to go through SAV. And I think that's important maybe for this group to talk about too, is the nationwide permit doesn't really offer any guidance on protecting the SAV resource outside of those lease boundaries, even though there are secondary impacts from lease operations, just getting to and from the lease in that regard. And we're seeing that more in North Carolina, especially on the backside of the Outer Banks, where we do have our larger beds. We are having more lease applications in those areas than we've ever had before.
Yes, thanks, Tim. And I just want to throw out for the rest of the group that this is an issue Tim has been working on much longer than I have. So I always appreciate his knowledge and advice on how to interpret these things.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I think there's a lot of people I know in the collaborative that have various types of project on this theme too, right? And I know that Long Island Sound Group, folks that are in the Long Island Sound Group are having a focus meeting on this topic too. I don't know if anyone wants to unmute and speak to that. That meeting's coming, is that next month or?
Yeah, Z, I can offer a few insights on that. It's going to be June 12th, but we have multiple topics. It's going to be restoration, primarily kind of seed-based focused restoration, water quality in Long Island Sound as it relates to eelgrass management and restoration, and management topics broadly. And one of the breakouts, we're hoping to have focus on this aquaculture and eelgrass interactions topic. So yeah, it's June 12th, and I can put the website for that in the chat if anyone's interested in joining us.
Yeah, please do. And I know, like Jamie, you've got a project coming up. If you want to share what you'd like about that too.
Well, sure. It actually ties in well with what has been presented today. We're looking at the impact. We're working with a shellfish grower who also works at the reserve with us, and examining the effects of oyster aquaculture gear on eelgrass here in Connecticut. We're investigating both the impact on the eelgrass itself, so looking at eelgrass metrics, and then also going the other way and trying to determine if there's any benefit to the oysters in terms of shell size and width and amount of meat in the shellfish. Yeah.
So there, I mean, certainly this topic came up for a reason and was voted in because there's so much of the SAV side of the science. And so that's where I was kind of hoping, Zach, if you're asked your question too, because I see your hand up, but then I was kind of hoping to get a feel from those on the aquaculture side. What are the, like, you've got SAV folk here. What are maybe some of the questions that might also be helpful for us to consider, given that we have that interest and are doing some of these types of projects? And one that, you know, I did in my own backyard here, Barnegat Bay, was working with an aquaculture industry, taking advantage of the gear field that he had out to see how it was impacting SAV and recruitment processes. And so are there questions that you're hearing from your aquaculture folks that you work with that are things that, you know, you wish that we would take into consideration?
Well, I raised my hand because I just really liked the comment I think Tim made about the best management practices around eelgrass. And I think that's really what the aquaculture people want to know is, you know, how can we manage our farm so that it doesn't affect the eelgrass in a negative way? And that includes what's on the farm and traveling between, you know, your dock and the farm if there's eelgrass surrounding your farm. So I think kind of nailing down that, and obviously what are the differences.
Oh, you cut out.
Different gear types, even, you know, can you hear me?
It cut out for a second. It was something brilliant, I'm sure, but that part was out. And now you're
Sorry. All I was saying is the different gear types. There's so many different gear types that we use in the Northeast, and like even floating, there's probably 10 different types. On bottom, there's 10 different types. So really, I think getting into the details of what the different gear types have effects on eelgrass is another thing. But also kind of what Jamie is looking at, that restoration with aquaculture, I think is another thing that people really want to see.
And there's an openness to taking in those suggestions, because I think to Aaron's point, you know, working with some of those growers and them potentially not following what's regulated. And I think someone else made the comment, like, if there's no enforcement, what does it matter if we come up with best practices from the SAV side? If there's no enforcement, does it really matter if there's best practices? But from your point,
I think,
there might
yeah, no, I think it's more than just like, you know, following the rules. Like aquaculture people like the fact that what they're doing is good for the environment, sustainable. They like to, you know, I think it's a social license aspect to it also.
Judd?
Yep, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Tim brought up something in his comment that I think probably this whole group can be thinking about, and in particular, Zach brought it up in his discussion relative to, you know, kind of linking the science to the industry. And Tim mentioned the nationwide permit, the Corps of Engineers nationwide permit that was, I think it was 2018 or 19 was the last renewal. I may be off a year or two, but and most of us scientists don't pay too much attention to it, but it's really important because, you know, everything feeds into that nationwide permit. It's built to, you know, make it smooth as possible for an applicant to get approval via the Corps of Engineers. It's the same thing that goes on with dock permits. But the point I wanted to make is that if you go back and look at the background material that was presented to justify the last renewal of the nationwide permit for aquaculture, most of the science came from the Pacific Northwest. And I think it's important that everyone here who's working on this topic, thinking about it either from a science or regulatory point of view, all of the information that's being generated by these projects is going to make for a much improved nationwide permit the next time it cycles. And I'm not sure, Zach, do you know, is it 10 years or what? But I think it's an important waypoint to think about, because I can see that there'll be a whole lot more science from the East Coast that can be pulled in to improve that nationwide permit process. I don't know. Do you have a thought on that, Zach?
No, I'll just agree with you. I think it is really important. I do not know when they're gonna, redo that permit. But I think a lot of states that don't have regulations around SAV and aquaculture just kind of fall back on that permit, and I think that's pretty restrictive. Again, there's the enforcement question, but I think in general, it's pretty restrictive to allowing aquaculture in eelgrass. So I think you make a really good point.
Other comments, questions? The 10-second rule when I'm teaching, just to make sure there are no more questions. So we can roll into kind of the last item on our agenda was really, I think there have been a lot of really great points, and there's a lot of great science that's still happening, and that need to merge these kind of two entities, one being the SAV researcher component versus not versus, because I don't think that's the dynamic we want, but the aquaculture, right, side. And bringing people together for this idea of a joint meeting. And this is something that Jesse and Brooke and I started the conversation. We kind of mentioned it during our steering committee meeting, and there was a general feeling of, yes, this seems like kind of this moment, given the industry interest, given this idea of some of the interchange between both aquaculture, the permitting process, and these ambiguities, and the level of science that has seen an uptick in recent years, and the efforts of restoration. There's a lot of money going towards restoration right now. And what does that mean in terms of where some of these leases can or could be going if there's not a lot of these state regulations in place? And so the thought was, why not use this as our in-person event? So on the schedule, you see that we did do, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we did do it last year, a mapping workshop, a 2-day workshop. And so we'd be looking to plan something for the fall. We figured the fall would be the best because it's outside the time that most of us are so busy with field season in the SAV world, as well as in the aquaculture world. That tends to be the craziest of the seasons. We floated the idea of hosting it here in New Jersey because that tends to be more centrally located. But we want to bring it to the collaborative, right? Because the idea is it's a collaborative. We want to do things in collaboration and ensure that that's meeting the needs and the interest of the group. So this is where we take the pulse of the group and see if that's in line with your interest and your thoughts. So interest, thought.
I have one thought.
Yeah.
I would just say, for the aquaculture industry, the fall can be actually quite a busy time of year. So the further you can push that towards the winter, I would say you might get more participation from industry members.
Is there a month suggest like November?
Yeah, like November, December, I think. And it depends on the region, but a lot of that prep from getting from the summer season to the winter season is a busy time.
And one of our other conversations was how to incentivize, right? Because this only works if we get everybody together, and we don't have a budget. We are all volunteering our time to be here. And so if we agree this conversation and this meeting of minds has value, what does that look like? if that's something we move forward. I can do a poll if we want to just start with a yay, nay.
I'm wondering if there are any big conferences planned for the East Coast or the Mid-Atlantic where we might, many of us might be headed anyway. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at, but I would imagine surf is due to be on the East Coast, right?
That would be for next year. So Surf
Yeah.
2025 is in Virginia. Ray is in October. Good point, Erin. Becky is always looking for an excuse to go to New Jersey. Oh, thanks for coming, Charlie. Kayla.
One more potential opportunity to for a meeting is there's the Association of the National Estuary Programs Tech Transfer. That's going to be in November. It's on Long Island, so a little more north than Jersey, but just another thought.
Tim.
Hey, thanks. Just to clarify, so you want participation from this panel or this group as well as industry folks, right?
Yeah, aquaculture folks. Yeah.
So it seems like that might be the bigger hurdle is getting in-person attendance that's representative of all of the East Coast, regardless of where you have the meeting. So I think that I don't know if the option for a hybrid meeting is available, but if you want to get some of that industry perspective involved in the meeting, you might have more success with that from a hybrid perspective, offering a remote option for people to engage in the discussion. Because I don't know that I don't know that you would get a lot of outside or industry folks from outside of New Jersey to participate if they don't have money to cover their travel or time. So, just a thought.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important, like you said, there's no point in doing this unless you can have both sides in the room.
Exactly. Other thoughts? Such a quiet group.
In general, though, is there sort of, maybe we should do a poll about, is even the topic, since we're not getting a lot of feedback. Maybe people don't want to share a no.
I know, right?
So maybe if we do
Do we even like this idea?
Yeah, an anonymous topic.
And we're afraid to even say and speak up. This is your collaborative. So the idea is we want to do something in person because there's coming together, right? We can accomplish some things. But if that's not, okay. Della.
Hi, so I completely agree with Tim that it would be difficult to have more participation, but I mean, at least from my experience working in shellfish compliance, a lot of these growers are not necessarily also the most tech savvy. I don't know, that's just my experience. So I don't know if there's like maybe an opportunity to do like chapters where we meet kind of on a local level and then we come together later on. I don't know if that's a possibility.
No, that's a good, so my thought was, so I partnered with a local grower for that project that I was talking about where I actually went on his lease and I was doing a project and I thought, well, what if I kind of harness the local growers to get the word out about this, almost like the tech transfer, but coming together to discuss some of the hurdles that they're experiencing when it comes to SAV. The idea is to get the growers to want to come, there has to be something in it for them. So this discussion about permitting and the frustration there, and then also the idea of having conversations with other growers. So kind of talk to my local growers and anyone in the collaborative, what would you want to get out of this? So part of it is the conversation between SAV and aquaculture industry, but couple it with your local growers and getting something out of that community as well. So learning new techniques as it pertains to what's going on with aquaculture, or if we're coupling it with what to do if you find SAV on your lease, and how we can maybe counteract some of the, although Jill, on your survey, I think someone said celebrate, which I loved. What they found, I was like, yeah, they're going to celebrate. So like doing that survey as a push out in advance, you know, to kind of get a pulse on what's going on. So I was already trying to think of how could we make sure there was buy-in for people wanting to come to an actual like in-person event. But if it needed to be hybrid, admittingly, like technology might not be the hybrid solution. And so if there were local chapters, to your point, like maybe in each of the states, would you host something stateside, state by state, as a quasi in-person hybrid thing? I don't really know. But okay, here's if I do, should we do it in person? Zach. Multitasking.
Yeah, just a thought to bring up on that kind of localized thing. You could pair it off. A lot of states have like either an aquaculture industry conference or a industry association meeting that you could kind of bring this in as a topic and discuss it at that, and then, you know, have it all come together in the in-person. But I totally agree with the others are saying.
Judd?
Yeah, I think building from the bottom up, from the industry perspective, to get their buy-in to participate in something like this is probably the biggest challenge, but it's the most, you know, it's going to be the one that really makes it all work. Because we all as scientists, the only thing that keeps us from going to meetings is having the time. We have the enthusiasm and the interest. We want people to see and hear about our work, but you know, there's a different psychology in the industry. And it made me think about, like, here in North Carolina, we could go to the North Carolina Coastal Federation and explain to them what we would like to do. And I think they would go out and poll and survey the industry for us. And if there were organizations within each state similar to the North Carolina Coastal Federation, that, you know, we might be able to work that into the process. But I think I feel really confident we could go to the Coastal Fed and say, here's what we'd like to do, and, you know, can you help us get the industry involved? And I don't know if other states have nonprofits or other organizations like the Coastal Federation here in North Carolina that would do that. But I think that's a pathway I would use in North Carolina to get the industry buy-in to considering participating. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Judd. So just looking in the chat, you guys are a chat writing group rather than an unmuting group, I'm learning. So I will read them. Let's see, reaching out. I think maybe the first step really is we planted the seed, eelgrass and shellfish seed here. And now maybe going back, engaging interest just to see if it makes sense. One of the concerns, I think when we were talking about this, the hybrid option is an option. I've just had mixed experiences with hybrid. Right. So sometimes it's like a total flop, and sometimes it ends up being a lot more work and not necessarily the best experience. I mean, we're all in, I feel like COVID, I don't know, I'm still in a COVID shy away from the hybrid thing. And there's so much that happens when you're in person where you're connecting with people, and these topics can be a little touchy. So we're talking about reaching out to particular people to gauge interest, which I think is a great idea. Maybe that's the next step that we need to do. Input from commercial retail oyster farm be helpful, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Reach out to connections just to see. We're floating the idea. So maybe the next step is that we come up with like a one-page or paragraph prospectus of like what we're going for with this type of conversation. Chris, go for it.
I was just gonna throw out there on that topic of working with commercial folks. we've been working closely with clam aquaculture farmers, particularly the Terry Co on the Eastern Shore, and they've been great. They've had a lot of input, and I think that they might be open to participating in something like this and providing feedback.
March is the best month for in-person meetings. Benefit to include other activities. So maybe November. So out of the poll for the 26 that responded, and this could be, I'm not great at multitasking, meaning writing a poll while running a meeting. Maybe a third option would be not in person. So maybe for those that didn't answer, we're saying we'd rather do hybrid, and that threw you off. So the idea is that we like the idea of a meeting and potentially doing a hybrid rather than doing it in person is the thought. So we're on the right path. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I mentioned the hybrid earlier, and hearing more of the conversation, I totally agree. AppNet does a whole lot of hybrid meetings ourselves, and they're definitely hit or miss in terms of engagement from the remote side. So I hear you on that. And the more I think about this, it seems like there's some states like Virginia and maybe others that have already gone down this road in terms of, getting all parties to the table and talking about concerns and getting state buy-in. But I don't know that's the case for other states on the East Coast, and certainly not in North Carolina. I could see this having a lot of value, at least from North Carolina's perspective, as a North Carolina conversation first, just to get the industry here talking to the scientists, and not just the industry and the scientists, but also the regulators and the politicians. So much of the rules and guidelines are political. A lot of decisions are not made based on science. And this is an economic driver for the state. And so that's the motivating factor for the most part. So, there's important to have industry perspective. Absolutely. It's important to have the scientist perspective, but also that other group is the regulators and the decision makers, the legislators who, are authorizing all of this in state waters. So I'm rambling here, but I think you're right. The hybrid could be challenging for this kind of setting. I think there is value maybe trying to step back and as doing this as maybe at a localized level, a state level first, and then maybe bringing the bigger messages from those smaller meetings to a larger discussion. And then I just want to echo what Zach said earlier. Judd mentioned Coastal Federation. He's right. They're very tied in with the industry here in North Carolina, but Zach also noted that the Sea Grant program in every state is as well. And that's certainly true here in North Carolina. Sea Grant, they are constantly holding mariculture conferences and development activities. So I would look to that group as well as another partner in engaging the industry in this discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I certainly, we don't have the power to change regulations, no law changing. I think that would be something important to ensure that that's the understanding, is that we can do none of that, but more shed light on where maybe the science can inform policy and regulations. And if there's a gap that becomes evident from meeting and having these conversations. Other thoughts? Jesse, Brooke?
Well, I always prefer an in-person meeting. And I think it would be beneficial. I can see maybe doing a pilot like Tim suggested in a state, and then seeing in like a specific state like North Carolina, and seeing what works, and maybe, I don't want to say traveling roadshow, but could like model it in in additional states. I can't imagine we're going to hit every state up and down the East Coast, but since there is so much variation between states of what's going on. I mean, there's a common theme. Obviously, we are all facing the same issues. but different states are at different spots with their regulatory position. So, yeah, I mean, I'd be down with sampling it out in one state.
I'm kind of curious, like, and sorry, but to kind of build off a little bit, like, Jill, you guys have already had this sort of meeting, so this may be a bit redundant for like Massachusetts. So I see the point, maybe some other states need to catch up a bit and then have more of a, like, what would be beneficial for states that may have already had this conversation, like?
Yeah, that's a good point. Although most of our outreach has been via like email listservs and things like that. So it's been very one-sided, us sort of pushing information out and just seeing what kind of response we get. But I really appreciated, I think it was Zach's comment about maybe trying to pursue these local organizations of industry members that already exist. They're already meeting once a year. The regulators are meeting once a year, and the industry is meeting once a year. So why not, leverage those already existing events and not ask them for more of their time, but instead show up there with some kind of, we could even have like a standardized approach across all of us, some materials we could share, educational materials type of thing, what we think as a group are the priorities where seagrasses and aquaculture interact, and start there. I really like that thought of starting there and then reporting back to the bigger group.
Well, and certainly the fact that for your survey, it was not responded to from much of the other states, that could be a further push and use the collaborative, given the value of the results that you provided for your state. It would be great to have better responses, and maybe something from the collaborative that we each own for our next meeting is to kind of report back.
Absolutely.
Which means if we're kind of going this direction, where do we then want to focus, sort of go back to steering committee and have the steering committee kind of focus on what to do for their state? And then does that mean we're going to do that instead of a group for the collaborative for the fall? Or we need to think more about like what, if we want to do, how we want to proceed if we do go back to the state level?
Yeah, I think if the idea is not to do a fall meeting, and instead push it at back to the individual state level, rather than call for a fall meeting of all states jointly. And try and work at the state level for the ongoing meetings that are happening for each of the groups, as well as, I would say, use Jill's survey. She's already done that heavy lift of creating that information. It just hasn't been percolated down to the state level. And use the steering committee for that. That still then leaves us devoid of our goal, right? Which as a collaborative, which is to get together every year for something. And so maybe go back to the collaborative for that idea, or if there are other ideas from the floor to get together for some other purpose and or topic. Well, for Ray is the fall meeting. I don't know if there are any people planning on going to that, but our next quarterly meeting topic would be nature-based solutions. If we wanted to tie into that, that would be one potential. Phil.
Yes, so I brought this up, I think, at the first meeting, and Jill mentioned it in her talk, and I'm wondering if at some point we can address it with all the brilliant minds we have in this collaborative of coming up with a definition of what a meadow actually is, and delineating those edges, and that would be incredibly helpful from a regulatory perspective, and it would have applications well beyond just aquaculture.
Okay. Have an in-person meeting to discuss what a meadow is.
And visit one in New Jersey.
So a field trip.
Yeah, but then I don't want to go in the winter. I'm in North Carolina and it's too cold for me up there.
I know, hence my fireplace. I mean, we didn't really explore the option of a field trip.
I love that idea though, Phil, of talking about what, because I honestly, I know it seems like something that maybe could be solved quickly, but having been in conversations over 4 years about how to define percent cover, like 4 years of conversations with that, like I feel like a meadow would be a long meeting for sure. Totally worth dedicating. So I like that idea. Thank you.
It's true, and have direct regulatory implications and be useful to many.
Can't we start that conversation just by email? You know, one of us drafts a basic definition of a meadow and, you know, just share it around the group and have everybody kind of edit and add to and delete and give thoughts on. I mean, that would be, we would need something like that, I think, before we come together in person. And then that,
Yeah, in general, people do better with a starting point of a document that we can contribute to rather than a blank slate. Then it becomes a free for all, which does
So there are multiple documents. The Corps has one which I don't agree with, and Washington Department of Natural Resources has a reasonable document on this as well. And so we wouldn't be starting from zero.
No.
You know, those are initial starting points for the discussion.
Yeah, maybe we could take all of those definitions that we can find. And I think that that actually came up in the Chesapeake Bay SAV regulatory review that, you know, we need a definition of what an SAV bed is. So maybe we do that. We gather all the definitions and, you know, come to some consensus on a mush together of all of them. The parts excluded. I think Katie's got her.
Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, I'm just, Emily put this in the chat too, but through our research with the Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative, we have identified definitions in both some of Connecticut and New York's, you know, background research that we've done, so we can offer those to the group. And just a thought in terms of the workshop idea, the that, you know, that was talked about earlier, maybe there's a way to think about how we can replicate some of Jill's survey work within some of our other states here on the East Coast before, you know, thinking about ways to have a workshop. So we could maybe think of a survey effort more broadly for local growers. And yet New York, I think we'd want to work with our local sea grants, as Zach pointed out earlier too.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Katie. Sorry, I turned off your video because you were getting really choppy. It's nothing personal. We're just trying to understand you.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I could certainly come up with a list of, I'm sure some other people on the call know, of the different events for the aquaculture industry in each state that we could either do like an in-person kind of surveying at, or use that as like a springboard to send a survey out to the industry in that state.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thanks, Zach. So I think at this point, I mean, we've got an idea moving forward in terms of not having a joint meeting for the fall. Instead, that's somewhat being replaced with the steering committee's task of completing or pushing for completion for the survey with Jill, as well as communicating at these aquaculture meetings that are going to be taking place at your state level. Communicating with Sea Grant. Sorry, reading the chat. So as far as Jesse, Brooke, I think maybe next step is really just communicate with the steering committee. So kind of regroup and figure out what makes sense in terms of our original goal for the collaborative, which was to gather together at least once a year for a purpose, rather than kind of spitball further ideas. We've got, I think, great couple ideas as put to the floor for defining a meadow, whether that then starts online first through emails and then comes together for a field trip in some capacity or site visit in some capacity.
So can we get an idea of who might be planning to come to DC for Ray in October? I mean, we could tag something on to that meeting. If a decent number of people are planning to come. We could do more than a happy hour like we did at SART an actual meeting. And then, I mean, October, we could always try for a field trip if the weather's not horrible. There's still a lot of SAV in the Northern Chesapeake Bay in October.
Yeah, I'll be at Ray. I put in a proposal for a session about SAV and living shorelines, but
I know the reviews are due by the end of the month. So
it's like you're on that committee, right?
yes. I think within a couple of weeks after that is when they're planning to let folks know. So in May sometime.
Looks like there's only 5 or 6 of us that'll be at Ray.
It's early still. More folks might decide to come. I know that well, a bunch of us are on multiple proposals that Ray is sponsoring for NOAA. So if we get the funding from NOAA, a lot more of us will probably go. But yeah, I'll be there.
I think we should like pull back and meet, since we're not getting a bunch of other ideas. So we'll meet with this steering committee and then move forward after that with more concrete suggestions for the fall. And it seems like Ray, I mean, like, seems like a good possibility, but we can chat and then come back. So there's no point in delivering if people are not responding.
We'll just ramble for the next half an hour.
We could. So with that, just get to the end of the announcements or the adjournment. Before that, partner updates. So we wanted to include a space in the agenda where anything that's going on in your home state, if there are job announcements, projects you're getting ready to start, publications that are coming out, any exciting news. So please let us know what's going on with you. Or you can write it in the chat. Your chat bot group, apparently. Nothing. Crickets. Tim.
Thanks, I'll add something.
Thank
you. Yeah, I'm sure Jesse let you guys know a lot of this because she's one of our main partners in our effort here. But ABNUP is going to be continuing our SAV monitoring this year. We're moving to our last subregion. So we divide our coastline into 4 subregions that we sample twice a year, April and May to get the peak abundance of Zostra, and September, October to get peak abundance of Haladuli. And this year we're at the last subregion, which is what we're calling Pamlico Sound North. So from Avon north to Manio on the Outer Banks. It's actually, the subregion has the most SAV of all of our subregions. But anyway, we're beginning that work. I think Jesse's going out in 2 weeks, and Charlie, who was on the call earlier, he helps out DMF. They'll be going out next week. So we sample 150 stations, and we also do the aerial flights for the mapping at the same time. So
awesome. Gearing
busy
up
time.
for field season. Yeah. Thank you, Judd.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing about what recently happened in North Carolina that I think is very relevant to the discussion we had today, linking science to the actual users, the stakeholders, the growers. And I wish Charlie was still here, but the agency that Charlie works for recently proposed a a number of areas to stop shrimp trawling in. And it was really interesting to see how it proceeded, in the sense that to some extent they use the information we're generating in the program Tim and just mentioned and Jesse's involved in, that we're doing and monitoring. The problem was that the regulator didn't really engage the industry, the shrimp trawlers, before they made this proposal. And you, you could see where, the proposal itself was a good idea, but, it failed to engage the shrimpers. And I think it's really, really important, if we want to move our science forward effectively, that, we do engage the stakeholders, especially the ones who's going to be socially and economically impacted by any decisions a regulator makes. So that's just thought there. Thanks.
Thanks, Judd. Jesse?
Hi, I just wanted to include a quick update. This will probably be more relevant to our next discussion about restoration. But there's some pretty exciting online tools coming from New Jersey DEP and Rutgers University, where we're looking to create some online frameworks to help make management decisions regarding restoration activities, looking specifically in salt marshes. And this is relevant to SAV because we're looking to include more information on SAV as we bring more SAV restoration ideas into the Delaware estuary. We don't have a super big program right now. We're hoping to develop it more. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring up really quick is if anyone had any potential seagrass data sources, primarily local to the Delaware estuary, that we could include. There's a pretty minimal amount of literature in our system. So if anyone has any local sort of knowledge or citable data, I just want to put a call out for that. And yeah, see if anyone had anything. And if you do, if you could reach out to me, I'll include my email in the chat really quick. But yeah, so keep a lookout for that, and I'll probably have a bigger update at our next quarterly meeting.
Great, thank you. Becky?
Hello. So just kind of general updates that might be interesting, also slightly more along the lines of restoration work. But so we are gearing up for our annual SAV monitoring at the Maryland Seymour site, just as per usual. And we are also working on kind of figuring out how we can use our new fancy drone to look at some SAV specifically within our Menai Bay component that has historically not had much SAV mapped, but via the VIMS flyovers. But we often see small patches here and there. And so we have been curious as to, like, are they just too small to really be relevant for the VIMS flyovers? Or a lot of folks, like, our kind of canned answer is that, oh, there's not much SAV at Menai Bay because it's very tannic. The brown water prevents SAV from growing. But I think it might prevent SAV from being easily observed aerially. And we are having that struggle with our fancy drone. But we're kind of figuring it out as we go. And we are also specifically trying to use that same drone process to look for SAV that has been historically mapped off of a thin layer placement restoration site that's been recently completed in the Deal Island area in Maryland. And unofficially, but so there was definitely some sediment overwash during the sediment placement process, although the contractors are like, oh no, it was just the Google Earth just happened to capture a sediment plume at the one time before we got our containment figured out. But so I'm very curious to see if there are SAV impacts, and we're trying out this new method that we will then ground truth. So that'll be an interesting process to kind of see through as an exercise to see if we can do more sort of drone stuff later, ground truth in the water or not. So that's what's going on.
Thanks, Becky. All right, Kayla, did you figure out the button? Sent you an unmute even. Not. Are you there?
Hold, it's freezing on me if you could hear me. Hold on.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. You can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, that's good news. Sorry, I had to jump onto my phone and have the Zoom app. So if you could hear me, that's great. I can't see anything currently, but that's fine. Sorry, it keeps like trying to get me to show myself. So I do have a few updates from Delaware. If you saw me put my name in the introduction, I did tag on SAV program because as of April 1st, it was not an April Fool's joke. We have a SAV program within watershed stewardship, and that is consistent of me. So it's just great for justification of getting all these SAV projects and discussions and on the ground for Delaware. So big step there. So look out from Denrick's SAV program with me. I also wanted to update that we have had discussions with our permitters about our subaqueous lands permitters regarding like restoration implementation projects that include seeding and planting of SAV, because that is regulated in Delaware. Vegetative stabilization includes SAV. So to get ahead of all of the potential funding opportunities and projects, we've kind of streamlined with our permitters to have a 10-year blanket permit that we are allowed to seed and plant SAV with certain conditions, but it's just would eliminate that individual permitting, which can take over a year or so sometimes. So that's great news too, that we have some of the logistics of that figured out. And within that permit also there is room for doing habitat suitability for SAV monitoring. So that would be like low impact scientific instruments to monitor specific habitat like water quality, light, temperature, again, because anything in subaqueous lands would trigger a permit. So even putting a PVC pipe in for a few months out of the year. So again, that would help us with some of our partners. I don't know if Taylor Hoffman is still on, but she is the other Delaware steering committee representative. So that's going to help there. And I don't want to take away from her. She had the update, but we partner with them to do the Rupia collection. And we have a turbulator built last year. So we're planning to do all of that again with them. And they would be able to operate under this blanket permit with us to do the habitat suitability monitoring. So there's just, some projects getting started in Delaware. I know we're not known for SAV, but just good news. And on top of that, we did have our statewide group started with Brittany Haywood and myself as the co-chairs. And through that group, we're gearing up for doing statewide monitoring in Delaware using, I'm still working on figuring all of that out, but stay tuned for updates about Delaware starting to catalog SAV. And that's mostly a freshwater focus since our inland bays have been mapped mostly, and there's not extensive beds there yet, but yeah, just some updates from Delaware. We're up and coming with our SAV, so it's all exciting.
That is great news, Kayla. All right, Chris.
So just a couple of updates on stuff that's going on here at the restoration monitoring program. So first, we've got a paper that's going to be coming out soon on restoration methods using Rupia. that Penny Hensel, former postdoc, wrote. It's coming out in the Journal of Ecology. And then that project, which is in the Lynn Haven system near Virginia Beach, it's funded by the Army Corps. We just have been approved for some additional work looking at faunal responses to rupia and eelgrass restoration in that system. And we'll be looking at epifauna, infauna, and nekton, and doing secondary production models. So that project's going to be going for the next 5 years or so. Our big restoration on the Eastern Shore in Burton's Bay, it's in our second year. We just checked 32 acres out of the 80 that we planted last fall. And we've got our first seedling establishment counts. Things are looking good in some areas, and we're learning a lot about depth and other characteristics that sort of dictate where we're having more and less success. And there's some potential partnerships coming up with a company called Ulysses to pilot some automated seed collection and injection planting methods using robots. So this is something that it seems kind of sci-fi, but they've been kind of piloting and testing these things, and they really want to work with us and try this stuff out here. So we're probably gonna be kicking that off in the fall. And we also, our aerial survey is getting ready to get going. Next week is our kickoff date for the next survey. And we have our sort of standard various sort of small projects that are going on here. And I think that probably the most interesting one to this group, which I'm hoping one of the students will be able to present that soon, is we've been looking at carbon stocks and stores between widgeon grass and eelgrass, and how that varies with depth and location in the Chesapeake Bay. And there's some interesting results that are coming out of that. That's my student Allie Hall's work. So maybe we can have her give a talk at some point. So I think that's most of what's going. Oh, and last but not least, we have been doing clam aquaculture SAV interactional work, and so we've launched a new phase of that research where we got a permit. We previously had done work in a farm where the grass had grown into the farm, just on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And we learned what we could from that. And there's a lot of interesting results. One of which is that it seems like the grass grows back very quickly in that system once the nets come up. And a lot of that is from heavy seed rain. Our treatment of adding seeds didn't have any significant effect because there's so much seed rain that's coming from adjacent meadows. So what we're doing now is we've gotten permits to, and this already happened, we've had the farmer put nets into an existing eelgrass meadow on the Eastern Shore. And so we're going to be monitoring basically what happens to the surrounding meadow as a result of those nets getting placed and faunal responses and seed production. So that work is starting this summer. And on that same project, we're wrapping up and hoping to present soon a historical analysis looking at the last 20 years of expansion of seagrass and aquaculture on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, and trying to figure out how much overlap there really is and what the future looks like in terms of coexistence between these bottom uses. Because as Aaron pointed out, it's a big hot button issue here. The aquaculture community is very worried that the eelgrass is going to push them out of business. And the good news is it doesn't look like that's the case. They don't actually overlap nearly as much as people were afraid that they would. So we've been kind of putting that all together and hoping to get that written up and submitted soon. So that covers what's going on with my group.
Thanks, Chris. On to Tay.
Hey everyone, great to see you all, and a really good meeting. So thanks to all of the people that participated today in the talks. I just had a really quick thing when Phil brought up the idea of defining the edge. I just went searching back into my files and I found where our Mass Seagrass group in 2022 had worked on this in like a little subgroup, and I have the written up kind of summary of what we came up with and all of the sources we looked at. So I was thinking maybe I could just send that around to the group as possibly a starting point, and people could add their thoughts to that.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Taylor.
Hi all. I just wanted to kind of piggyback a little bit off of what Kayla had already updated on. Just to say where our group is planning to do suitability monitoring, hopefully starting in May, which will be really exciting. And we're expanding on top of some sites that we had monitored last year in the hope to then plant wood and grass seeds next spring. We're also actually, Kayla and I are going out to kayak around unknown baygrass bed next week to then hopefully collect some more wood and grass seed in the next 2 weeks. And that's what we'll be storing and then planting again next year. So that's about what our group is up to. Just Kayla covered a lot of it.
Great news. Great partner updates from everybody. I feel like we're going to have to budget more time for that. It's to have that many updates from this group is truly phenomenal. So carry this with you the rest of the day into the weekend, all this great seagrass work going on, all of this SAV work going on. And if you're on the steering committee, be looking for more details from us. Also, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, DC, we need more reps. So go reach out into the communities that you know. Find more people and enjoy, like I said, the rest of the day. Enjoy these bonus 15 minutes or so. Thanks, guys.
Yep. Thanks, Z. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.